Tracing Your Family Roots. I'm Chuck Mason, the host of the show, and we are sponsored by the Mount Vernon Genealogical Society. And with me today is Robert H. Pratt. We're going to talk about, Bob had an interview with Janelle that was taped earlier. We're going to talk about researching the Civil War and specifically the U.S. colored troops and Bob's ancestor. So Bob, welcome to the show. Bob is a retired lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army, and he served over 20 years active duty. And he served that basically here in the area, in and around the Pentagon. So in the first segment, we talked about his ancestor, Adrian Vassar, who was a first lieutenant and a quartermaster attached to a Civil War regiment of the U.S. colored troops. And Adrian was his ancestor who served. So before we talk about this, we want to talk about who were the U.S. colored troops and how did they become authorized as a part of the official army?
When the war started, there was a good deal of reluctance to put black men in uniform and give them arms, although there were calls to do just that. Mm-hmm. Perhaps the most prominent voice in that regard was that of Frederick Douglass.
Right.
And there were others too, William Lloyd Garrison, for instance. Then in 62, things changed, 1862, things changed. There were some reverses in the Federal Army, embarrassing defeats, especially for the Army of the Potomac. There was a decline in white enlistments. Federal commanders in the field, U.S. Army commanders in the field, were crying for more manpower. And runaways and freed slaves were running into federal lines. What do we do with these folks?
Right.
There was very quietly the establishment of a 5,000-man colored unit in the South Carolina shore. It was done very, very quietly. It was still a sensitive matter.
Right.
But then came, in June of 1862, the Second Emancipation and Militia Act by Congress, signed by the President. And what the act did was to free the slaves of masters who served the Confederacy. And further, that act authorized the President to induct the free slaves, the free men, for with any purpose he so chose. Mm-hmm. And that was a remarkable thing in those days.
Right, right.
There were a couple of successes, battle successes, and I'll name them. One was at a place called Milliken's Bend in Mississippi. And that was the brave defense of a U.S. Army depot, which happened to be the jump-off point for Ulysses Grant's drive to take Vicksburg. And the success of that defense was well publicized. There was a statement by the Assistant Secretary of War, Charles Dana. And he said, this has completely revolutionized the impression we've had of the efficacy of colored soldiers. They can fight. Mm-hmm. They know what they're doing.
Right.
That was followed in July by perhaps the most storied engagement of colored troops in the Civil War. And that was the assault on Fort Wagner in South Carolina by the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, led by Robert Gould Shaw, Colonel Shaw. He was killed with his men during that assault. But that was a famed engagement. And that helped to change the attitude toward the use of colored troops to preserve the Union and win the war.
Right.
Then, with the Battle of Antietam, and the fact that the Federal Army didn't lose the battle, there was this political flooring, if you will, for the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation. Mm-hmm. And that took place just a few days after Antietam, but it was effective the 1st of January, 1863. That made possible the formal establishment of the Bureau of U.S. Colored Troops in May the 22nd, 1863. And from that beginning, there became more than 140 colored regiments, infantry, artillery, cavalry, and a pioneer, or that's the old term for engineer.
Mm-hmm.
And there were some independent commands as well. By war's end, there were 209,145 people assigned to the Bureau of U.S. Colored Troops. That was about 180 troops and then the officers, or the cadre. That was a big number.
Yes.
Yes. That 200,000 number was about 10% of the Army's strength by the end of the war. In fact, at the end of the war, General Grant said that the U.S. colored troops were an invaluable in the defeat of the South.
Just one of the things that I have seen a number of times, the movie Glory, focuses on, I believe it was one of the units from Massachusetts, and although if you watch it, there are inaccuracies there, but it does give you a view into, a unit and some of the things that they dealt with. They were not always well received.
No.
And yet, they were, as you say, an invaluable part of the war effort and winning the war. One of the things that I have done with these, for our viewers, hopefully you know that your ancestors, when they were in the military, there were the compiled service records, which is a record of the men's service, that the government compiled these from a variety of sources. And there is hopefully one for each of our ancestors that served, but also they were eligible, a lot of them, for pensions, and the men who fought with the U.S. colored troops also were. So there were pension files that were compiled. And, for many people, like my second great-grandmother's first husband, fought in the war, was killed in a Civil War battle down in just outside of Richmond, but she was eligible to collect a pension, and so were her children. And when I went and got the file, it's 14 pages long. Nothing. And then after the war, she married her second husband, who also, my second great-grandfather, who also was in the war, and his is like 8 or 9 pages long. Yeah. The files that I pulled, and I mainly was pulling these, the assistant librarian in the Princeton, New Jersey Public Library got a hold of my name somehow, and she was having me copy the files for the men who fought in the U.S. colored troops from Princeton. And what she was doing was writing biographies of the men to be placed there in the library. And I probably did 40 to 50 of these pension files. And most of them were more than 100 pages long. Some of them were 200 to 300 pages long. And there was one, was really a very sad situation. It was a man, was the biggest one I did for, it was over 300 pages long. The man disappeared. His family hired private investigators, spent years trying to find him, and they never could find him until he died on the streets of New York. And reading through the file, he probably had dementia, maybe, post-traumatic stress disorder that we have today, those kinds of issues. But, the family did everything they could to try to find him. Mm-hmm. And one of the other things that makes these files such a wealth of information is African Americans didn't normally get into everyday records
That's right.
way that Americans would. They weren't necessarily recorded in the birth records, the marriage records, the death records. So they had to go out and get people to give information, give affidavits, and you would find, file after file of affidavits of people, and made very interesting reading. I envied the files because I thought, why couldn't I have something like
Sure.
this for my ancestors?
Sure.
So, but it was, like I say, very interesting reading that I did all of these files for, and I don't know, she retired from the library. I know she hadn't finished it when she retired, and I don't know whether she continued. I think that the determination that she had, she probably did finish the project, but a great resource for people looking for information on their ancestors. So you had a second-grade uncle, Adrian Vassar, who was a first lieutenant and a quartermaster. What can you tell us about him?
He had been in the grocery business in New York City when the war came, and he left it to do his bit. And he signed up with the New York 176th Infantry Regiment. And that outfit saw action in Louisiana in 1863. In an engagement with the rebels near a place called Brazier City, Louisiana, he was captured, held for about 2 months, and then paroled by the rebels. Then Vassar, Sergeant Adrian Vassar, returned to the 176th, and soon thereafter was commissioned as a first lieutenant quartermaster with the 87th Colored Infantry Regiment. Apparently he was very good at what he did. This was at a time when there were teams going out recruiting officers for the U.S. Colored Troops regiments, and most of those officers were white.
Right.
And so he joined, and that unit was posted on Brazos Island, Texas, as part of the ill-fated Red River campaign under Nathaniel Banks. And in February of 1864, he and his commander, Colonel Matthew Kempsey, made a casual day's visit to Mexico across the Boca Chica Inlet. And their trip over was fine, but not the trip returning. The tide in the inlet was far too strong. Vassar entered the water on horse, and he and the horse were swept away. Vassar drowned. His body washed up on the Mexican side. It was returned to Brazos Island, where it was interred. Ultimately, all remains on Brazos Island were moved to the mainland, many to Brownsville. I've lost track of where his remains actually are, but his grave marker is with that of his parents in the Poughkeepsie Rural Cemetery in New York State. And his name is on the African American Civil War Memorial in Washington.
Yes, that's a memorial that is in D.C., up in the U Street area, northwest.
In the Shaw neighborhood.
Yes, and quite an impressive monument to the men and all that they did for the war. So, what is actually, or what does a quartermaster actually do?
He's a
in the
supply
military?
officer. He's a supply.
Okay.
Yeah.
So he's the one that you get all the food, all the provisions, equipment, those kinds of things.
Yeah. He was a staff officer. Yeah.
So, you have done research on him and the family, or?
A little. I'd like to do more.
Okay. What exactly have you done to research the Civil War then?
Well, of course, I went to the archives, looked at his pension records. A cousin who lives in the Hudson Valley, unrelated to the Vassars, did a lot of internet research.
Okay.
And that's where I found through her, this newspaper account of his drowning, an eyewitness account, which is in the New York Times. That led me to, when I discovered that he had belonged to the U.S. colored troops, then I went to the African American Civil War Museum in Washington and talked with the folks there, especially the curator, the late Harry Jones. And I was able to find out a little bit more about him. I'm particularly interested, and haven't done much, in his descendants, if there are any.
Okay.
Now, it was reported that he had a daughter. One account of Adrian Vassar was that he had 3 children. Another account was that he had just the one, the daughter. So I haven't taken it any farther than...
Now, did you say you did get his pension file?
Yeah.
For his wife got the pension.
Yeah.
Were there any children mentioned in that?
Yeah, a daughter, Emma.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Her name was Dempsey. Soon after Adrian's death, she remarried to a fellow named Alonzo Hubbard, and he promptly died.
Okay.
And the last I knew about Dempsey is that she was traveling door to door in the Midwest selling patent medicines.
Ah, so it's one of those things that she may be one of those missing ancestors out of the census records.
Yeah, that's a good point. I hadn't thought of that.
When you're doing, census records is one of the records that most genealogists
just use,
go to right away because there's so much there. But certainly would be worth doing a kind of a United States-wide search for her, and possibly might come up with her. But it's much more difficult when somebody moves around like that than if they stay in one place.
Yeah, I would appreciate if, not myself, but if someone would do some more tracing about the possible location of Adrian's remains.
Because if they've moved the bodies around, that really does make it difficult. Supposedly for my second great-grandmother's husband, Charles W. Potter, it's assumed that he was probably buried on the battlefield because, 3.5-day battle. But at one point they did disinter men, and they were kind of moved around in the Richmond area. And at one point there was a mass grave in Hollywood Cemetery, and they did have at least a partial list of names there. And I went to Hollywood Cemetery a number of years ago, and they had opened a new national cemetery over near the Richmond airport and had moved the bodies over there and sent the list over there. So I didn't get to even see if he might appear on that list. And so far I haven't gotten down there to take and do anything. So, I know we have a slide of a lot of sources for doing Civil War research. So, Bob, would you like to mention some of those that you think are good sources for people to get started with?
One of them is a little book called Tracing Your Civil War Ancestor. It's by Bertram Hawthorne Gruen. That's the way I pronounce the name. That's Groene. It's a superb little book about references. And it was my first step in finding other references. There are, of course, the pension records at the archives. There is also the OR, which is the official record of the United States and Confederate armies in the War of the Rebellion. That's 128 volumes. And that's a massive collection of all kinds of documents about what happened.
If you're in the DC area, where might we find it? Is there?
Oh, the National Archives.
National Archives has it?
Yeah.
Do you know, is it still downtown, or do they have it out College Park?
No, it's still downtown. I'm not sure about College Park, but I do know that you can find the OR in most state university libraries, and it's free to use. And you'll also find it in libraries in some of the larger cities.
Okay.
There's also a companion piece, which is called the ORN, and that's the official record of the United States and Confederate navies in the Civil War. There is the Civil War books, which is very comprehensive, and it's by Alan Evans, James Robertson, and Bell Wiley. There's a terrific book, which is the military bibliography of the Civil War by Charles Dornbush, and that's spelled with a D, not a B. That's a great place to trace officers.
Okay.
In fact, I looked at that when I was trying to trace Adrian Vassar, and that's when I discovered in all of these Hudson Valley regiments, all these officers with Dutch names, beginning with VAN. And,
Right.
Right. There is the official register of the volunteers of the U.S. Army for the 5 years of the war, 61 through 65. There are all kinds of source books held at state archives, and I can't emphasize that enough. I've looked at the Military History Museum in New York State to try to find a picture of Adrian Vassar. I've so far have failed. There are also here in Virginia some references at the Virginia Polytechnic Institute in Blacksburg, and also at the state capitol in West Virginia.
Okay.
In West Virginia, of course, we have this case where West Virginia broke off from Virginia and declared for the Union.
Right.
So you can find
Right.
records on federal people.
And that points out that, when you have boundary changes like that, you want to look in both places.
Yeah.
Because sometimes, even though West Virginia may have broken off, there may still be things in Virginia, in Richmond, at the Library of Virginia. And you also point out something that I found interesting in dealing with New Jersey, and I was doing this for someone for Revolutionary War records, but the state had records with information in it on men who were in federal records, but the information in the state records was not in the federal records, and vice versa.
Yeah,
and
it's interesting.
So you really, when you're doing research like this, you want to look at anything. I always tell people, go and look, because you never know what you're going to find. Don't think, well, I'm not going to find anything, because in the case of one thing I was doing for somebody, she was trying to prove which one of three men with the same name in the same area was her ancestor. And the two of the men ended up in federal service and had records in the National Archives, in the federal records. The third one did not, but it was information in the state, which gave his wife's name. And there was enough to correspond, so you could figure out who he was in the federal records, that she was able to use that. So it's important that you cover all bases and look. The main thing is, you may find there's nothing there.
That's right.
And you know that.
That's right.
But, if you're only not looking, you're only assuming, you never know what you may have missed in there. So we're getting short. Is there anything that we didn't cover that you want to add to what we've talked about? I think this has been informative for our viewers.
Yeah. Something on the regiments. Not only are there regimental histories, but there are rosters. And that's important.
Yes.
Also, one of the facts that I'm sure you have discovered is that sometimes names are not well known. And this is quite true with the U.S. colored troops.
Yes.
Some descendants don't quite know the name of the ancestor who fought in the war, and that makes research extremely difficult.
Yes, yeah, and well, in spelling too. Spelling is
yes.
another problem that,
Yeah.
you know, people didn't always have a uniform way of spelling names
That's right.
and things. My great-grandparents that came over from Scotland spelled, the name was Peyton, spelled with one T or two T's, and in their records, you know, couple of records, it's one T. Couple more, it's two T's. They flip-flopped back and forth. It's not until my grandfather's generation that they uniformly spelled it with the one T. So you really have to, in researching, cover all bases and look at all possible spellings to be sure that you don't miss anything. And of course, another thing is, you know, ages are not always uniform, so that can make a difference also. So, Bob, we really appreciate you taking your time to come and talk to us about this. You know, I just recommend, if you haven't, whether it's U.S. colored troops or whether your ancestors were in the regular army and were white, you know, go and look at the military records if you get a chance, because you never know what's going to be in the files that they have downtown. And of course, some of it is on things like Fold 3 and Ancestry. And we also want to thank the Mount Vernon Genealogical Society for sponsoring us. The Society is starting a new group of special interest groups, and we are going to be starting one on African American research. So you can go to our website, mvgenealogy.org, for more information. And we're hoping to open up in the next month or two and start meeting in person. And once we do that, we invite our viewers to come and visit us, hopefully join the society, but come to our meetings and join us, visit with us, and see all that we do.